Happy Friday, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to get started in just a minute. Feel free to grab a glass of water, a cup of coffee, and then we'll get started. Happy Friday, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Guillermo Gomez. I'm Program Director at the Urban Design Forum. We're delighted to be partnering with the SoHo Broadway initiative today to launch SoHo Broadway Public Realm Vision Plan. In case you're new to the Urban Design Forum, we are an independent membership organization that mobilizes civic leaders to confront defining issues in the built environment. We empower professionals of diverse backgrounds, industries, and perspectives to shape a better future for all New Yorkers. We investigate complex challenges in the built environment, study alternative approaches from cities around the world, and advance progressive strategies to build a more democratic city. A big thanks for the continuing support of our fellows, our board of directors, and director circle. Today's presentation is part of our New Streets Ahead initiative. Over the next year, the forum is exploring ways in which New York City can boldly transform city streets to create connected communities. When COVID-19 hit last year, we saw how our streets became sites to socialize, dine, exercise, protest, and play. City government responded nimbly to the crisis by piloting the Open Streets programs, enabling restaurants, businesses, and people to reclaim street space from private vehicles. Over a year and a half has passed, and we're obviously still in a global pandemic, but today New York is fortunate to see rising vaccination rates along with rising subway ridership. Folks are excited to get back to the office and reconnect with friends and family. And next week, New York City will elect a new mayor and a majority new city council, which means the forum wants to start thinking about ways we can make these new uses on the street more permanent in the coming years. So over the coming months, we're organizing nearly 50 Urban Design Forum fellows to dream up new visions for our streets across the lenses of climate, care, commerce, culture, and continuity, 1 year and 8 years ahead. We're excited to share new visions and mobilizing ideas for New Yorkers and work with the next administration to shape more people-centered streets. As we organize case studies and render new possibilities, we want to hear from you all listening in today. What people-centered streets should we be looking at? Who should we be speaking to next, both in New York City and abroad? Feel free to plug your thoughts into the chat. So today we're excited to organize the first public conversation of the SoHo Broadway Public Realm Vision Plan. SoHo's transformation over the past century has been astounding, from manufacturing to artist hub to retail center. Obviously, SoHo is iconic to visitors from around the world with its historically significant architecture and innovative cast iron facades that everyone is familiar with. The neighborhood is blessed, obviously, with great public transit, numerous universities just north, and galleries and artist spaces still located in and around the area, inviting a mix of users and visitors in the public realm. Yet as visitors and residents and workers in the neighborhood grow, pedestrians are clamoring for more space. As we've seen across the city, the pandemic has highlighted the dire need for more open space. And further, recent climate events have also highlighted the dire need for more green infrastructure to keep our residents safe and our businesses afloat. So today's event will be dedicated to reimagining who our streets serve. We're delighted to have Mark Dykes from the SoHo Broadway Initiative, Rebecca Karp from Karp Strategies, and Mike Leiden from Street Plans to share recent pilots and a new vision for the neighborhood's public realm that shapes more people-centered streets. After the presentation today, I'll ask a few questions before I welcome our invited respondents to share their thoughts on ways to carry out this plan in the coming months and years to come. So let's get started. If I can welcome Mark, Rebecca, and Mike to join me on screen, please. So let me quickly introduce our three incredible speakers, and I'll pass the reins on to you all. Mark Dykes has been executive director of the SoHo Broadway Initiative since 2014, guiding the organization's sidewalk maintenance, pedestrian and public safety, and community development advocacy efforts. Mike Leiden is a principal with Street Plans, an award-winning urban planning, design, and research advocacy firm. He is internationally recognized planner, writer, speaker, and advocate for livable cities. And Rebecca Karp is managing principal and CEO of Karp Strategy, which utilizes a data-driven, qualitative, and place-based approach to planning. I want to thank the three of you for joining us today. We're excited and privileged to have the three of you join us and share this vision for SoHo. And I'll pass the mic on to you all.
Thanks, Guillermo. Really excited to be here and to be joined by Mike Leiden from Street Plans and Rebecca Karp from Karp Strategies. Also excited about the opportunity to present the SoHo Broadway Public Realm Framework and Vision Plan, hearing reactions and answering questions about the plan. Next slide. Wanted to start right here on the ground. This is hopefully a familiar site to many of you. SoHo is one of New York's most recognized neighborhoods. It's known for its one-of-a-kind loft apartments, our historic cast iron architecture. It's known as a arts and culture center, a shopping area, a job center, and just a popular place to visit. It's a place to see and be seen. SoHo, as you mentioned, Guillermo, is continually evolving. Most of the buildings in SoHo were built in the second half of the 1800s, starting off as a retail center originally, transforming to a manufacturing and warehouse center, becoming an arts and culture neighborhood with loft living. And today it's back to being a retail center, but also continues to be a job center, here in Lower Manhattan. And SoHo has adapted with the times. The demands of the public space have also changed, but SoHo's sidewalks and streets remain the same as they were close to 50 years ago. As the pandemic has ebbed, we've seen a steady return of people coming to SoHo to shop and visit, and slowly return to work. But we've also seen a return of some of the chronic issues that face our neighborhood: congested sidewalks and too much traffic, to name a few. Next slide. I want to bring you closer into the neighborhood and talk a little bit about our study area. The SoHo Broadway Initiative, which is the organization that I represent, is the neighborhood-focused not-for-profit that manages the business improvement district along Broadway from Houston to Canal, as well as the intersecting cross streets of Prince, Spring, Broome, Grand, and Howard Street. Most of our buildings, over 50% of them, not only front on Broadway, but also front on Crosby and Mercer Street. For the purposes of this vision plan, we included Crosby and Mercer Street, given so many of our buildings touch Crosby and Mercer Street, even though there's parts of Crosby and Mercer that aren't included in our district. The initiative is a unique organization and a unique bid, and that we represent residential and commercial stakeholders equally. Next slide. So why create a public realm framework and vision plan? There are some longstanding issues around quality of life that we've known anecdotally and heard about and seen with our own observations that were recently highlighted in the Envision SoHo NoHo report published in 2019. Those issues include overcrowded sidewalks, traffic congestion, lack of green space, lack of open space, lack of places to seat, and noise issues. The pandemic, as tragic as it has been, has also led to fundamental rethinking of how streets and sidewalks are used. And SoHo has very little park space, and our public space, our outdoor space, is the streets and sidewalks of SoHo. The pandemic gave us a moment to pause, to see what others were doing around the world, and encouraged us as an organization to embark on this rethinking of our outdoor spaces and how we could make our streets and sidewalks better for residents, workers, and visitors. Next slide. I'm going to hand it over to Mike to talk a little bit about what the existing conditions are in the neighborhood.
Great, thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everybody. So we had the great pleasure of doing a lot of the existing conditions analysis alongside the initiative. And with a district of this scale, you can actually get quite granular, which was a pleasure to kind of really understand. Yes, we know there's traffic. Yes, there's not enough seating, but we had a chance to really dig a lot deeper into a number of different, urban design and public realm issues, challenges, and opportunities. I won't go through all of them in any level of detail, but you can flip to the appendix of the plan if you're interested in digging into all the thinking that we did about the neighborhood as it is today. Next slide. But one thing I would like to highlight is that, and it was touched upon earlier, is that really SoHo is the people, right? We love the architecture, we love the history there. There's great retail, all those great things, but really it's about people who come and go, who live, who work in the neighborhood and the way that they use and inhabit the district. You see a tremendous display of public life, lots of various activities happening, but some of those activities are not done comfortably. There could be more things happening safely. There could be more programming and certainly safer and more inviting streets. And so that's really what this plan is all about, is building on that wonderful street life and making sure it's more comfortable and safe for everyone who lives and inhabits and travels to and through SoHo. Next slide. So to dig into not just the physical conditions, but what people think, both who are visitors, but also who live and work here every day. Rebecca Karp and her team at Karp Strategies dug right into what stakeholders think about the district. I'll let her describe that process and the outcomes to you all now. Rebecca.
Great, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mike. Sorry, next slide, please. So, as we all know, when we take on these kind of planning efforts and think about vision plans, it often, starts and ends and continues to be about people, right? So as Mark laid out in the very beginning, this bid is really unique. It's representing both residents and businesses. The district is crowded with a whole number, lots of different kinds of spaces. And stakeholder engagement here, we really wanted to make sure we were reaching out to all different types of people who are in SoHo. So stakeholder engagement for this initiative involved 3 primary activities: a street side intercept survey before the winter holidays, a digital survey that got pushed out through multiple channels, 2 different focus groups that included residents and representatives from the business community, which were compiled and rolled up for analysis. The project additionally included regular meetings that the SoHo Broadway initiative facilitated with the SoHo Broadway Initiative Public Realm Task Force, which included board members, elected officials, and agency representatives. So lots of different types of engagement with people throughout the district. Over 200 people were included throughout the engagement from December to March and ongoing. And key takeaways that you can see here, included a whole range of things, from better waste management to celebrating the art and history that we know is so important to SoHo, with this historic cast iron district, thinking about how do you provide space for gathering and pedestrianized streets, creating a greener corridor. Mark already mentioned there isn't as much green space in the district as many people would like to see, more dining options, But overall, what we really saw bubble up across all the different engagement touch points were this desire to expand sidewalk space and reduce vehicular congestion. And we heard that again and again, and really thinking about that. So as we think about those two main things that bubbled up, what we're continuing to think about then is that, engagement is an iterative process. It doesn't end with the publishing of a vision plan. It doesn't end with this presentation today. This is just a snapshot that we're sharing here about where we are now. And this is just a snapshot of engagement. So I just ask you keep that in mind as we're going through the rest of the presentation today. Next slide, please. Great. So as we'll be talking about, SoHo's public realm is a place where we know public and private interests, local, global cultures, and trends old and new are colliding. And as we think about SoHo Broadway, the way I think about it, at least, is as an economic anchor and engine for the city. And we're certainly going through a prolonged recovery as far as economics go. It's a residential neighborhood. It's a place that attracts visitors from around the city and the world. And together, we've really sought to ensure the vision that's put forth here is guided by key concepts that help us look forward. The following 8 principles that are laid out here really guide the public realm framework and plan. And we suggest they should be continuously referenced as the plan moves forward into the implementation process. So I'm just going to take a minute to just read these 8 points out and that you keep them in mind as we're going through the rest of the presentation. So we're aiming to create a public realm vision plan that is safe, comfortable, inclusive, and dynamic, and that will be beautiful, connected, creative, and resilient. And that this vision and these key thoughts apply to the district's systems, its places, and its economy, all that are underpinning a public realm that will best serve its people. So these are the things we want you to keep in mind as we're moving forward. Mike, I'll pass it back to you and we can go to the next slide, please.
Thanks, Rebecca. So based on the engagement, based on the existing conditions analysis, we move forward with the team to develop draft and then final vision and goals. So next slide, please. But first, I think let's just set the frame on what a vision plan is. It really is an opportunity to set a physical and optimal vision for the future for a specific geography. In this case, it would be the SoHo Broadway Initiatives District and the study area. And it provides a moment in time when we can all ask ourselves, what do we want to become in the future? What do we want this place to be? And then from there, offer guideposts with a framework of principles, goals, and priority projects, which are all laid out in the plan. And really, I think for the SoHo Broadway Initiative and for the City of New York and all its different agencies, it's a moment to try and build some organizational alignment to help focus, what is always going to be limited resources moving forward. So it's as Rebecca said, all that engagement is iterative and it's a long process. But at the moment, that we're in now, the idea is to try and get people on the same page about where this district could head in the future. Of course, creating a vision plan does not require city agency or community board approval at the outset or through the creation of the plan itself, but implementation will absolutely require city agency partnership and action, of course, and broader community support. So again, this is the start of a process for really rethinking the streets and sidewalks and the overall public realm in SoHo. Next slide. So we developed this vision statement to put a finer point on it, which is that SoHo Broadway is the beating heart of one of New York City's most engaging, beautiful, human scale, and walkable neighborhoods. The streets and sidewalks prioritize people first, creating comfortable, safe, and compelling public space that supports businesses, meets the needs of residents, and welcomes visitors from around the world. Next. I won't read through all the details of the goals and the metrics that are contained therein, but we will go through the top line here that obviously we want to create more space for people. Within that, we think there's a real opportunity to also streamline district operations, whether that's parking, whether that's bus operations, that's waste removal, that's freight delivery, that's service vehicles who keep these buildings running all day long. There really is an opportunity, I think, to get all those things to happen collectively and happen more efficiently. Next. And of course, support and expand cultural activity. If we had more public space in the district, more cultural activities could take place out of doors and in the streets. I think there's a real hunger to have that activity be more visible and more accessible to a wider audience of people. And of course, to increase the district greenery and resilience, this is more important than ever. SoHo really is a large heat island. There's very little tree canopy. And you'll see throughout our plan, we're looking to increase that tree canopy by a lot, trying to really bring in greenery for shading and cooling, and of course, beauty. And then finally, improve district connectivity within and outside this district and neighborhood, and traffic safety, so that people walking around of all abilities and ages feel safe and can cross the street as they need and want to. Next. So I'll dive into the framework and vision plan and some of the highlights. Next slide. So we'll zoom out to the scale of Lower Manhattan. And this is really the physical framework, which is an introduction to all the policy and larger transformations that would need to take place to kind of set this frame in motion, which is to create a low traffic neighborhood, not just in the SoHo Broadway district, but in the SoHo neighborhood at large, and then inclusive of Nolita and Little Italy. And we see there's an opportunity to use streets that are better optimized for through traffic, to handle that through traffic and focus on that through traffic, and keep the little streets and all the lovely charm and walkable interior streets in the neighborhood to be for resident access, for public realm enhancements, for delivery, and freight and operations. And if we were to pare back the through traffic, particularly along Broadway and Broome, I think it would open up a whole world of possibilities for the streets and public spaces that are within this area. So to do that, we're really also building on a larger framework, which the city has been undertaking at the Department of Transportation and other partners for well over a decade, which is to bring this green and pedestrian-oriented spine from Central Park all the way down to Union Square. And we've also seen great advancements of enhancing the public realm from City Hall down to the Battery. And so really where the SoHo Broadway district sits, it's directly between Union Square and City Hall, and plays a really key physical role in the continuation of that thinking and of that work that's already underway to create more pedestrian friendly and transit priority streets. Next. So to deliver on that framework, we've developed a number of recommendations, which you can dig into in the plan, which focus on tactical moves. Those are the low cost, the cheap, the trying things out, the demonstration projects, the art installations, all these things that can be done relatively quickly and can advance the principles and advance the goals of the plan, leading into some larger strategic initiatives, which would be policy change, interim redesigns of the street, and continuing the work to improve the operations of the district over time. And then finally, looking at what we've developed as 4 key moves, which would be large transformation projects of the district to invest in the long term in the neighborhood's public realm. And of course, all this being supported by the day-to-day actions that the bid is already undertaking with engagement, with the cleaning of the streets, removal of trash, programming, et cetera. So those are really key that those things happen now or happen long into the future, which is the mission of the bid. Next. So we'll get right into it with the key move number 1, which is to create more space for people on Broadway. Obviously, that is the main thrust of this plan. It's the main corridor in the district. And so if you go to the next slide, what we're trying to achieve is more of a seamless experience from building to building, with a linear busway, but really treating this as a linear public space for people to walk, to enjoy, to sit in. You can see the increase in trees and shade, fixed seating, flexible seating, and of course, looking at opportunities to improve the operations with taxi pickup and drop off, with certain types of deliveries, and of course with the bus operations, and always making way for emergency access and emergency vehicles. But at the end of the day, we want this street to look, feel, and function as the public space that it already is, the public space that it wants to be in the future. Next slide. So the vision is to really ease the challenges and improve the quality of life for office tenants, for retail establishments, and of course for residents and visitors. Exactly how this gets done in the future, right, is subject to a lot more engagement, a lot more study. But we think that setting the broad vision of a street that performs better for pedestrians first is the right frame for a vision for the future for Broadway. Next. And of course, using that toolkit, using the materials and the process that the Department of Transportation has pioneered here in New York, and of course for cities around the world, is how to think about interim redesigns and what are the physical changes that can be made, in the near to midterm that would release some of that pressure on the sidewalks, expanding the sidewalks, adding some of the planting and greenery and seating, and really trying to work towards this future and understand through trying and doing and measuring and testing what the long-term result and what the long-term design and investment should actually look like, down the line. Next. Key move number 2 is to share Crosby Street and Mercer Street. And of course, this is a district, this is a grid, it's a neighborhood. One street doesn't operate in isolation. And so really to get the vision to happen on Broadway, we need to see changes made to Crosby and Mercer Street as well. Next slide. And the idea here is to bring in a lot more amenity to the street, to handle some of that service vehicle demand, some of that delivery demand on the side streets by increasing some of the available parking. Of course, Mercer and Crosby Street, you're not allowed to park during business hours on the street. So we think we can handle some of that demand, but primarily to add a lot more of the vibrancy for the retail, to provide amenity for residents and visitors, and to be very site specific and selective about where those amenities go and how they're placed and what they actually are. So again, the rendering here is just a simulation of some of the elements which we know are in demand, such as bike parking and delivery zones, and of course, increased seating. And you'll see there very prominently, there's a bike lane. So we're really envisioning that dedicated bike access, which is very difficult to do now coming from the north, could happen along Mercer Street, not precluded on Broadway, but would be dedicated on Mercer, connecting down to the Grand Street lane, and then of course over to Lafayette and down to points further east or south. And so that would be a nice mobility improvement for the cycling network, and would help make that movement safer, more predictable for people walking and driving as well. Next. So really we're envisioning a capital reinvestment in Mercer. The street has some pretty rough materials and old materials that need to be reinvested in, rebuilt. We think this is a really big opportunity to kind of put back on top a street that's much more comfortable, and again, fills that gap in the bikeway network long-term and adds a lot more of the greenery and amenity that's currently missing from the street. Next. So key move number 3, and we'll speak about this also again in a few more minutes, but this is pedestrianizing Prince Street and Howard Street. And the street you see here is Prince looking east at Broadway. And if you've stood on this corner, you've tried to cross the street here, you come up from the subway or tried to enter the subway, you know how challenging this can be, particularly in the afternoons and especially on the weekends. There's such a crush of demand for space, and that space just doesn't exist today. And so you see a lot of difficult things happening, a lot of frustrated people walking, and of course, people even driving, trying to get through here as pedestrians cross the street. There's just a lot of challenges and issues with the public realm here. And so go to the next slide, please. The vision here is that Prince Street, like Howard Street, could be pedestrianized and could either be managed as time of day or day of week, but the detailing of the street and the possibility for programming of the street would allow for it to serve as again, that release valve and as that open space that doesn't currently exist in the district. And so you can see just some of the amenity that was part of this vision and the kind of the design quality that we're thinking about when we think about the long-term future of Prince Street. Next slide. So Prince Street, as well as Howard Street, would be different types of public spaces. Prince Street is a different corridor than Howard. Howard's not a through street, but in any event, we would see those spaces being lightly programmed with arts and culture. You would see, certainly better and safer access into and out of the subway. You would particularly see people walking north and south have a much easier time of doing that on Broadway if this change were to be made, both in an interim and long-term way. And we really see this as an opportunity to also bring in the amenity of, a cafe kiosk, perhaps something that place you can get a sandwich or soup or bite to eat in the middle of the day, which doesn't really exist in the neighborhood in the public space. And so it would really be an inviting way to do that, servicing different populations based on the time of the day and the day of the week. Next slide, please. So again, how do you peel that back? That longer term vision into something that's more interim. Well, we're seeing a lot of this. We have seen a lot of this kind of approach all over New York City with the Plaza program. and now even more so with the shared street or slow street program that you see in lots of different parts of the city now. Flatiron is a great example. They've just introduced both a couple pedestrianized interim plazas as well as slow streets. And so if you have not gone to see how those perform and how they operate, I would certainly encourage you to do so. This could be another way to kind of roll that out in this location on this block, and potentially, include other blocks as well along Prince. Next slide. So fourth and finally, and perhaps the biggest challenge, is to reclaim Broome Street as a local street. Broome Street is the bane of, I think, a lot of residents and shoppers and visitors' existence, particularly at peak rush hours and on weekends. This is clogs up Broadway, it clogs up other side streets. It makes walking a particular nightmare if you're going north and south on Broadway. In fact, many times you can't even physically cross the street because the cars are bumper to bumper throughout the intersection. And so next slide, please. The goal here is to transition the street through a wide array of larger scale sort of framework level changes at the policy and physical planning level to eventually reclaim Broome Street to be a local street servicing the neighborhood. If that were to happen, you could certainly open up better operational space for deliveries, ride hail, pick up and drop off, bike parking, waste storage and removal, seating, greenery, all those things become a possibility once we've diverted or shifted the traffic away from this primary corridor. And I think the way we think about this street is that it would have the same sort of detailing as Broadway, and that detailing in terms of materials and design elements would just wrap the corners and head one block east and one block west to Crosby and then to Mercer Street. So it would be inclusive of those two intersections. And so you would arrive in the district and really feel that you're entering the SoHo Broadway district. It's a primary jobs hub, retail hub, residential community, and it's worth celebrating that with special design and materials. Next. And then what would that look like? Again, peeling back to more of an interim redesign to kind of test some of these elements. I mean, this is a great opportunity to say, did we get enough loading zones in? Do we have enough places for pickup and drop off for taxis? Do residents have an easy enough time getting in and out of the neighborhood? That's certainly one of the concerns and complaints we've heard, is that people who live here have a hard time leaving and coming back if they're coming back using a vehicle because of all the congestion. So this would be an opportunity to try those things out and test them, move things around, and iterate before any long-term investment would be made into this corridor and of course into this district. Next. So, to sum it all up, the goal here is to really build the support and the political will and the excitement over a generational investment in this neighborhood's public realm, something that Mark noted has not happened for several generations. This moment in time, the demand and the needs are there, and this is just a vision for how that could happen over time through an iterative and open process to create that lasting change. Next slide. So I will hand it over to Mark again to kind of close this out. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think that previous slide talking about the generational investment, acknowledges that change is hard and that there are some longstanding ways of doing things that people have come to accept. The pandemic has shown us ways that we can rethink our outdoor spaces, the noise, the traffic, the crowded sidewalks, the lack of green space and seating. We've seen cities around the country and around the world rethink how those spaces are used. Our framework and vision plan takes some of that best thinking to reimagine SoHo sidewalks and streets in ways that prioritize people over vehicles, creating opportunities for greening, gathering, public art, seating, and other important amenities that have long been called for and will address longstanding quality of life issues. What we have here is a picture of our demonstration project on Little Prince Plaza. That's one of the next things. That's one of the things, one of our next action items. We've closed down Prince between Broadway and Mercer to vehicles on 4 consecutive Saturdays. We have one more Saturday to go, and it's allowed us to see how the space is used and how the closure impacts the neighborhood. We've had largely a positive response. We've seen people use the space in many ways, and ways that we did not anticipate. But it's been fun to watch and observe, and and people, as you can see here, are really using the space well. Want to echo some points that Mike and Rebecca made about engagement. Engagement with the community will be ongoing to get reaction to the plan, as well as the engagement that will be required if this plan is to move forward. We're here today to listen to reaction, answer questions. Again, I want to thank the Urban Design Forum and Guillermo's team. We'll also be hosting a series of question and answer sessions, as well as presenting the plan in other public forums. So very excited to share the plan today, and really excited to engage in the conversation. So thanks so much.
Terrific. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Mike. Congrats on an incredible and bold vision for the neighborhood. We obviously have a lot to dig into from what we've heard so far. I want to start with a couple of questions before we invite our experts and respondents on screen to really dig deep into the details of the plan itself. We also want to make sure we include questions from attendees. I see many forum fellows in the audience joining us today. I welcome you to plug in your questions via the Q&A button so that just we have them all kind of consolidated in one location. So I want to start with just kind of a quick high level question. I know this plan has been obviously many months in the works. And when I think about the purpose of a kind of a vision plan like this, I think about the ways in which kind of it uncovers and unlocks things that may not have felt doable before, even before the pandemic. What does this plan make possible that wasn't necessarily possible before in the neighborhood? And why is it such a perfect time and opportune time right now to kind of carry this vision forward in the next couple of years? Maybe we can pass it first to Mark and then kind of the rest of our presenters.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why we undertook this project was that when we saw the city rolling out their open streets agenda and open streets, we really were fitting that into this neighborhood is complicated. There's so much demand on our streets and sidewalks, from pedestrian use to deliveries. It just made it very difficult for us to do that. And I think what our vision plan is unlocking is it's putting people first. SoHo is a very human scale neighborhood. It's very walkable. And this will give more space for people to do that, which they can't do today. It's bringing in amenities such as greening, seating, art, gathering space. One of the anecdotes that I've seen just from using Little Prince Plaza is like I've been able, and we as a team have been able to have so many conversations with members of the community about a whole host of things, whether it's what's going on in the neighborhood, Little Prince Plaza or other things. And I think it's just it actually this vision plan will create more opportunities for both residents and other members of the community to gather, but also people that are coming into the neighborhood to have a spacious and comfortable experience when they're here.
Maybe Mike or Rebecca, any thoughts? If not,
Mark covered a lot.
Okay, maybe it's just to hear from you, Rebecca. I know I just kind of want to revisit that earlier statement that you made on kind of the role of a vision plan and kind of that process and how it's really kind of an evolving and collaborative process. Maybe you can just speak to that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'd love to speak to that and then maybe pick up on something Mark said, about kind of meeting the moment and what we're able to do, during the pandemic. So I think about the vision plan and kind of the moment in time and it being an evolving process. I mean, there's no way you can work on a vision plan like this and, engage people over a short period of time and then say like, okay, we're done and move forward. No way. Like, I think if there's anything that, Mark and Mike and I value above anything else, it's like putting people first and prioritizing people. The whole purpose of the Business Improvement District, of the SoHo Broadway initiative, is to prioritize the needs of its members and advocate for their needs, and to work on finding that balance between advocating for business members and residents and thinking about what they need collectively moving forward. And so I think for a vision plan like this, thinking about then, what do we need in the public realm for businesses, for residents, for visitors, and finding that balance and moving forward is an ongoing conversation. And so I think that's what's so exciting about like the pilot for Little Prince Plaza. It gives you a chance to say, you know what, there's so many big things we want to do. It can feel intractable to take on something as big and as challenging as like Broadway. My first job in the city was on Broadway between Prince and Spring. And I just remember being like stuck on that corner that Mike pointed out when you come out of Prince Street on the R and not being able to cross the street. It can feel, when we first started working on this project, I was like, wait, we're thinking about redesigning Broadway, are we nuts? But you think about testing one thing, the pop-up on Prince Street, and then you learn something new. And we think about then, okay, how do we bring it back to people who actually live here? So I see a lot of comments in the chat from residents saying, well, how does this work for residents? We're thinking about noise. Okay, we're testing Little Prince Plaza. What are we learning about noise in the district? We're thinking about deliveries. What can we bring back then to talk to with residents and businesses? What does this mean for shoppers? So it's testing ideas. So not letting like the perfect and the big, be the challenging thing. Let's like try these interim ideas to getting things done, and constant communication and feedback loops. So Mark's talking about Q&A. There's going to be the ongoing task force meetings. There's going to be ongoing testing, so we can refine and move forward with some of these big ideas. So I think in my mind, that's what I think like authentic engagement looks like, and how you can move what seems like a really big idea forward. What do you think, Mike?
I was just going to say on the issue of noise, I know that's a concern for residents. It's a concern for anyone who sits there on the corner on Broome Street, has to listen to the honking while they wait to cross the street. It's just very, very loud. And just what we learned on Prince Street, I'd say a lot of things over the last several weekends, but one of the things we've learned is a lot quieter. We've seen the decibels go down by 20, which means that the average rate that we've measured over several measurements at the corner of Prince and Broadway was well above what's considered to be safe. 70 decibels is what's considered safe. We've peaked out at 98 decibels on that corner. With Little Prince Plaza, that number's come down by 20. We're now into the safe range for noise. So again, these are just data points. These are things to be thinking about and be communicating that this is what we've learned. Do we want more of that, or do we want to find another way to deal with the issue of noise and quality of life? So these are just, all these things are one way to go about doing it. But I think you're right. The point is that we learn by doing, we learn by listening, and it's really easy. It's really easy for us to listen to people when we're out on the streets and trying these things out in a very low risk way, like one Saturday or a couple Saturdays over the course of a month, right? And so just thanking everyone who's already come and talked to us. It's allowed us to reach a whole other level and group in the neighborhood that we're not necessarily part of our initial public engagement. So this has been really helpful for us.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Rebecca. And we're definitely going to get into some environmental challenges in public space shortly with our experts. Maybe we can kind of turn and invite our respondents on screen with us. Thanks, Mark, Mike, and Rebecca again for that presentation. I'd love to welcome our two respondents to join us on screen. Jimmy and April, just a quick introduction for each of you. Jimmy Kim is Chief Strategy Officer at the New York City Department of Transportation. In addition to her leadership at DOT, we invited Jimmy because she brings 20 years of experience in managing complex urban development transportation projects across the country, having held leadership positions at HRNA Advisors and Sam Short. So she's coming in with not only kind of a street design and expertise hat, but also economic development cap on. We're excited to have her own views and perspective, given her diverse disciplinary expertise. We also have April Schneider, who's an associate and smart mobility practice lead in Stantec's New York City office, where she works on a variety of public infrastructure projects, helping teams identify opportunities for sustainable or resilient design principles in planning and design projects. She's also participating in Urban Design Forum Streets Ahead working groups and has been in the thick of these topics, both in and out of work. Welcome both. Thanks so much for joining us. So,
thanks, Guillermo.
Absolutely. So you're both experts in design, planning, and policy. So I'm glad to have the both of you kind of dig deep into some of these details on the plan. Maybe we can turn to you first, Jimmy. You're very familiar with the neighborhood in our conversations. So it'll be really lovely to hear from your perspective, given that you're also kind of a user as well. You've led numerous economic revitalization projects in New York City and across the country. So what parts of the plan resonated with you the most, and What are some opportunities to build upon or potential challenges we might face to advance a vision like this moving forward?
Yeah, thanks, Guillermo. Yeah, full disclosure, this is probably one of my most favorite neighborhoods in the city. I spent 30 years as a student, as a worker. I spent probably about a decade at the cable building. So I've seen Broadway in Houston when it used to be a number of gas stations and looked very different from what it is today. Not in the direct study area, but when I was an art student, I spent time in the original CBGBs before it turned super fancy. So I have a little bit of nostalgia for the olden times, but I'm also really it's all about change and progress. That's what makes the city so exciting. And really, this is a very interesting time for a compelling vision. So I'm really excited to dig into this. And thanks again for inviting me. I just want to, before I kind of have some questions and thoughts, I want to provide some backdrop as I see it, or context. On the transportation side, we are certainly, this is, as many of you have already said, we are coming out of a grand experiment, from the COVID lockdowns with the popularity and also challenges of open streets and open restaurants that are allowing us to really be, fairly bold in exploring these options. But we're also seeing traffic return to pre-pandemic levels across the city. Car ownership has absolutely skyrocketed. I think there was something like 225,000 new vehicle registrations. There's an increasing competition for curb space. Freight deliveries continues to be on the rise, and the city gets 90% of its deliveries by truck and vehicles, so that's not good. On the flip side, in addition to the open restaurants and open streets, putting the DOT hat on, we have been full steam ahead with bike lanes, with busways. We're announcing a new busway at Jamaica Archer and Queens this afternoon. So, this is all sort of consistent with what's going on. And then I think sort of even bigger picture, I know there's the SoHo rezoning, there's big questions about equity and fairness in the city. So I think there's a lot of competing needs. And so the second part, sort of how I segue from that backdrop to your plan is sort of what is the, how does the public realm improvement that you've proposed and that will continue to evolve help to form and shape the future identity of this district? How will it support, and how does it advance the goals and needs of the residents and new residents and businesses? I mean, in particular, thinking about economic development, how does a public realm plan make the commercial sector and the retail sector more resilient? We all know how COVID and the related drop in tourist and visitor volumes have really impacted SoHo's businesses most critically. And then I think, the key to all of this, and again, putting on this sort of implementer's hat sitting in my seat, is how we take the plan or aspects of the plan from vision to implementation. So, as I started to, dig into the plan components, it's expansive, it's great. I know we're not going to be able to do everything at once. How do we make decisions on which components of the plan to prioritize? I think at DOT, we would love to get more support or from the community on busways. We'll have to think about, this concept you've proposed. I don't think I've seen anything like that in the city. And we all know that the conflicts between bikes and vehicles and pedestrians is very real. And as we see the growing, numbers of e-mobility vehicles, that's becoming a bigger issue. So I think we want to really talk about safety. I want to sort of put safety on the map as well. We're having a tough Vision Zero year, so we want to make sure all of our plans are protecting all of our users. I want to, sort of put in, I think I've seen freight come up a lot, and deliveries. I think there are real opportunities to get creative about freight, and that is something that our commissioner is really passionate about. Whether it's off-hour deliveries and getting more merchants to sign up, neighborhood loading zones, micro distribution hubs, really rolling out more human-powered, micro distribution vehicles, cargo bikes, and the bid's ability to help organize the businesses to really create an impact there. And then I think, the big question is with all of these projects, how you sequence them, because all of them, we're going to have to dig into traffic studies and how each of these projects, for example, when I saw Broome Street, I was like, that's great, but then what happens to the tunnel? How do we get all these people out of the city? And I know it affects a lot of other neighborhoods, and really thinking about the decisions we make, especially in light of the fact people will not get out of their cars. So those were the sort of thoughts I had. I'm really, excited to get into the Q&A and get into some of these topics.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. And I've jotted down all those thoughts, and I'm really excited to kind of dive deep into the broader conversation with amongst you all. And then lastly, let's turn to April. You bring a breadth of experience in planning and environmental engineering, leading public infrastructure projects that support car light, but also climate resilient neighborhoods. I'd love to hear what parts of the plan resonated with you that you would love to discuss and unpack, and think about ways in which we can make these visions into a reality.
Yeah, thanks, Guillermo, and thanks, Mark and Rebecca and Mike. That was really great. This is the kind of plan that makes me really happy, both as a professional and as a New Yorker. What the plan really does is essentially bring the Barcelona superblock idea to New York in a setting that feels absolutely perfect for it. The cobblestone streets, the narrow street walls, the vibrant atmosphere, the tourists and the locals mingling together. And it's really an area that's in desperate need of more space for all of those people. So it's kind of taking the lens that we've had through the pandemic of using our streets to cope with and recover from it. And this plan is just an expansion and broadening of that. So a few themes that emerged for me that I work with and deal with a lot, that I think are handled really thoughtfully is, first is the environment. Trees are really critical to any streetscape. As imagined here, they provide shade, and that will be increasingly important as New York gets hotter and hotter as a result of climate change. Something that we should think about really as a city as we really start to implement more trees on our streets is how we do that, because the real challenge is not just what goes above grade, but what is below grade as well. So there's utilities on Broadway, there's a subway tunnel. How you get water to absorb through in-ground planters as opposed to the above grade ones, which is also critical for the climate aspect here, is really a big challenge. We move utilities all the time for things like stairways into subway tunnels. We don't think to move them for things like trees, and that is maybe something we should be reconsidering, knowing the importance of trees and bioswales and stormwater management in the city. Another thing is mobility. I think something we need to grapple with really thoughtfully is how pedestrians, bikes, and buses mingle in shared spaces. Biking as a form of transportation is incredibly, incredibly important to mitigating climate change. And what we really need to do is think about this on a network level. There are, we see bikes and pedestrians mingling in shared streets all over Europe. And there's still a question mark really of whether or not that will work here in kind of this short term. There's cultural things that also influence the way that these two modes really interact. I don't think there are easy answers, but it is something that deserves a lot of thought, because ultimately bikes and people deserve to be using the streets. And then lastly, the deliveries and waste management issue, both delivering of goods to buildings and then picking up waste, are something that have come to the forefront of many people's minds over the last few years. It's really complex. The solutions really need to be multifaceted. It's part policy, it's part design. On one hand, we need to reduce demand across all of these things and pull in time of day considerations. And on the other hand, we need to accommodate these movements in ways that do not harm other street users and really reduce the conflict. So I think this plan has really done that quite well and quite thoughtfully. And there's, as Rebecca was just saying, there's a lot more study to be done and a lot more working with community to be done to really realize these types of things. Terrific.
Thank you so much, April. I'm ready to dig deep into some of these topics that you've kind of laid out for us. So before we kind of jump into a broader conversation amongst the five of you, I just, again, want to invite any questions or thoughts into our Q&A box. We're excited to kind of integrate some of your questions into our conversation today. So maybe I can kind of start our discussion today, which is maybe specifically kind of around maybe the concept around connectivity and networks as how we generally envision streets. I'd love to expand on some of the challenges on connectivity that we've kind of already discussed today, both as an issue of kind of flow and mobility, but also thinking about social connectivity. So right now, as we see the mobility of cars is often prioritized specifically in this neighborhood and across the city. So how did you approach reimagining connectivity? And this is to the presenters, but I'll of course open it up to our respondents to think about. How did you approach reimagining connectivity with surrounding neighborhoods, especially for bikers, pedestrians kind of passing through? But again, also I think which came up in some of the responses from visitors coming through the local subway stations.
There's a lot there. Do you want me to start, Mark? Do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, let me just quickly I think frame it a little bit. I think, this is a very walkable part of Manhattan. Like, I think one of the things we learned during the pandemic was without all these cars, like, wow, it's only so many minute walk to here, so many minute walk to there. And we were constantly, just as, staff that were working, being in the neighborhood every day, finding out how walkable this place was without all these cars in the neighborhood. And Mike, go ahead, and I'd love for you to build off of that.
Yeah, I think this framework, this neighborhood, the connectivity, the quality of life, all of this first and foremost depends on a New York City government that creates a policy and starts to operationalize that policy with a reduction of driving through the city overall, whether that's a resident driving, whether that's people driving through from one point to another. If we can't achieve that, then we're going to have major challenges, not just in our public realm, but with climate, right? And with mobility and access throughout the city. And so this plan assumes and hopes that we will have that as a defining framework in New York City, that we're going to reduce the number of cars. Once you assume that, once you expect that, then you can start to pick away at all the other different strategies that have to be mobilized and operationalized, from parking policy to think about when you do divert traffic, where does that go? What does that impact? Who's that impact, fairly or not? How you handle that? What are the intersection treatments? What are the modes that you're accommodating, when and how, buses, bikes, of course, investing in the subway. And so this is a vision where we assume that to be true. We assume that there's going to be that commitment to climate and that commitment to equity and fairness through the reduction of unnecessary car trips through neighborhoods. That's a big move at the moment, but it's a move that many of our peer cities are operationalizing now and have been doing for quite some time. And then when you look to the future and you see what those cities have done, you see the really positive ramifications of the benefits there. And you see a lot of things like traffic evaporating, people switching modes, people taking trips at different times of day, investment that can be reprioritized from auto infrastructure into transit and walking and cycling. And so we've got to get those frameworks in place at a citywide as a national framework for change. And once we can do that, then a lot of these smaller things that we're proposing that are tactical can be experimented with, tried, tested, and then evolved over time to truly meet the response and the needs of individual neighborhoods and communities. So I know that's a big answer, but that's where we need to go, and that's where we haven't gone yet.
Terrific. I want to actually pull in already a question from the Q&A box because it kind of connects around the topic of congestion and traffic. This is from Michael Chen. To what extent did you consider the impact of traffic diversion from streets like Broome on surrounding and considerably less affluent and less white neighborhoods like Chinatown? kind of curious on the planning process if that was taken into consideration.
Sure. So if you were just to divert all the traffic today and do nothing else to mitigate, then that would be a disaster for other streets, right? But we also do know that at certain times of day, there's more capacity on some of those streets that may be unrealized as well. I think we've seen, checking just the traffic in SoHo on weekends, you see that Houston Street typically has orange or green markings on Google, whereas mostly SoHo is bright red, right? So if we can move some cars to some of those types of streets, whether it's Houston or Canal, then I think there's at times of day, there's excess capacity there. To reduce, again, we need to reduce the overall demand to make sure that the streets that can handle more traffic are not doing so in a way that's creating another Broome Street somewhere else. So that is one of the suggestions, or that's one of the ways we're thinking about this. We haven't talked congestion pricing yet. We're not dependent wholly on that to make this quality of life move. That's going to be one of the tools that will help, but it's not going to solve this problem. There's lots of other policies and changes that have to be put into place. But I think the ethic of the plan and the thinking of the plan is not to just say, hey, let's take Broome Street and dump it onto Houston, or dump it onto the Bowery, or dump it onto Canal Street. We had to be thinking more comprehensively than that.
Thanks. So I'm also thinking about specifically on kind of the management of the street and competing stakeholders. This was a theme that came up on a couple of responses, and I'm also seeing in our Q&A as well. How can we manage the street in a way that the various users aren't necessarily in competition with each other, and it's a little bit more harmonious? Obviously, it takes a lot of management and partnership. And I definitely welcome thoughts as well, Jimmy, because I know this is a point you kind of introduced in your response. How can maybe either the presenters around the vision, if you can speak about the plan and whether it, how does it accommodate trucking, loading, and goods movement? Because I think this was something highlighted in the comments as well. How is that in coordination with the bus lane and the bike lane running down Broadway?
So I guess I'll start. I think, it's important to acknowledge that, we're talking about shared spaces here, right? We have residents that are here living in the neighborhood. We have businesses that need merchandise to come in, and we have garbage that needs to get picked up. If you look at Broadway, there's notches along Broadway that would allow for deliveries to continue to be made on Broadway. We don't anticipate that fundamentally changing. Also been noticing comments about off-hour deliveries, and while I think that is an approach that might be good generally for the city, I'm not sure that's an approach that's good for SoHo. We have a number of complaints from folks that live in the neighborhood about overnight deliveries and how negatively impacted they are, and we've stated that pretty clearly. But I also think there's a number of opportunities in rethinking this space that where there's innovation and for consolidation, using some of these micro distribution approaches to get freight into the neighborhood with fewer trucks, and then maybe even with using e-bikes and other alternative strategies. So I think that's what one of the real goals of the plan is, to rethink that, right? Like, there's so much conflict from those sorts of operations that and there's been a lot of innovation that's happened that we need to try out and figure out how to fit into this neighborhood to make things better for both residents as well as businesses.
Right. And imagine you are the FedEx driver who is driving down Broadway, has to get curbside, can't, have to make a delivery on time to keep moving, struggling to do that because of the congestion, and you double park. And you put yourself at risk, you put others at risk, and that is, you maybe collect the ticket, and that's the cost of doing business in New York City on Broadway, right? So imagine if those spaces were dedicated, they were short-term parking, and those were better coordinated and managed during the day, then some of those conflicts would be greatly reduced. That truck driver would be much safer if they're not, switching from the last mile from a truck to a bike, a cargo bike. I mean, there's just lots of ways that this plan thinks about those issues and thinks about, well, how do we make it fair and easy for everybody to do what they need to do and get where they need to go in the plan. I think as far as the buses go, this is brought up, we have not seen these kind of streets very often, but just take Fulton Street in downtown Brooklyn, as a busway. It's almost the exact same dimensions as Broadway, building to building. The only thing is dimensionally, there's a fundamentally that we're thinking through differently here than Fulton Street is bringing that busway up to level with the sidewalk. It helps with accessibility, helps with the awareness of slowing things down, has cross permeability that becomes possible, just like you see in streets in cities around the globe where transit, bikes, trams, buses, all share those streets appropriately. And so it's a big leap for people, but we've got little snippets of it already here in New York City that have been working well for a long time.
I mean, what this part of the conversation is making me come back to is, I think, some of Jamie's questions that you posed, Jamie, in reflection to the plan, particularly about, how is the plan supporting resiliency for the economy? What is it doing to advance the goals and needs of residents and businesses? And I think this question then about commingled uses on shared streets and sidewalks, for me, it gets to like the very identity of like, who is the public realm for? Like, who are we planning for? Who is this vision for? How will the streets and sidewalks be used? Right, I think that's the core, that's the gist, that's the guts of the question. And I think what we're all grappling with. And I think if we've seen anything from doing this kind of, public realm planning and visioning work pre-pandemic, during the pandemic, now as we're fighting our way through recovery, it's taking the time to pause and work through these questions together. There's no perfect answer, no silver bullet, right? And so that's why I love the approach of having these like smaller test projects where we can really explore these things together. So it's not a cop-out answer, right? I think it's important to take the time to explore it, because I will say that as someone who cares so deeply about the economic health of neighborhoods, right, as an economic development practitioner, like I care so deeply about if businesses can survive, and I care so much if residents can leave their house and feel safe and comfortable walking to get milk, for cereal the next morning. It's really important to me. And when we were doing the engagement for this project, like there were some business owners, like literally tears in their eyes, telling us about how, they didn't know if their open street, open restaurant pop-up was going to make it. And it was going to be make it or break it for their business. And then a few days later, talking with residents who, with tears in their eyes, like couldn't sleep because there were people hanging out in those sidewalk sheds until 3 a.m. And then 3 days later, talking with people who with tears in their eyes, would feel so stressed because the sidewalk shed maybe was in conflict with the delivery they needed for their business. And people care so much about the space in which they live and work. New Yorkers were so passionate about that. And everyone has ideas for how to make it better. And we're trying to figure out then what does it mean as we're reinventing the public realm when we're thinking about how to make Broadway better. And so I think when we care so much and when there are pain points then we're trying to solve for, and we see there's so much opportunity and we're testing something new, it gets challenging. And there's this beautiful and challenging and really hard moment in which, I think my dream and vision is then like, how can we not get stuck on what feels really hard and miserable and then say, okay, we're going to try something like Little Prince Plaza, see what feels good and not good, and then talk about it and try something else. Because I think, Jamie, to your question, like I think that's how we can support resiliency for residents and businesses and people who work there, is like to test it and talk about it and be honest with each other about it to the extent that we can.
Thanks for
And just, sorry, I'm looking at the chat. I'm not saying off-hour delivery is the solution. I was presenting it as part of the toolkit, but I just wanted to go back to Mike's point that the private sector, they have an interest in really pursuing these much more, human scale, environmentally friendly, smaller vehicles. So, each community is different. This is a very active commercial, district. So I think, our DOT is very much focused on, we've done a great job. We've had a decade of really advancing, moving people through bikes and buses. The next decade is about also moving our goods, because it is, I think it's not a sexy topic, but it's something that, really triggers a lot of folks. It is a real impact.
Totally agree with that.
Thanks, Jimmy. Maybe we can move into some environmental challenges, especially thinking about delivery. Maybe maybe moving more specifically into kind of waste management, which is a nice highlight of the plan. It's exciting to see kind of the specific vision moving with an interesting approach for waste management on the street. How are you all thinking about that kind of that topic amongst the kind of the choreography on the street logistically with the different types of uses?
I'll take that one, Mark.
Yeah, I think we have a limited space. We have a complex, we haven't even mentioned the subway running underneath Broadway. So I think it's challenging to fit in the greening into this neighborhood. I think one of the great parts of this vision plan is that there's a lot of flexibility. I've also read in the comments about challenges with landmarks. What we're proposing here is a planter approach where that can be moved and will fit into the neighborhood where we can. I think if you look at the Prince Street Plaza renderings and those beautiful trees that are peeking out from Broadway, I think that's very doable. But it's going to be challenging, using a planter system and fitting that into the neighborhood. But that's really what is needed because we're trying to fit this into a built environment that's already here that we have very little control over, and we don't want to touch. We also we're in this landmark district with some of the most beautiful cast iron buildings that we don't want to hide, but we also need to bring in some of that greening.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe moving in from kind of waste to climate goals, and I'd love to bring in April into the discussion. April, you've led kind of numerous green infrastructure projects to support neighborhood resiliency. I'd love to hear some of the challenges. I know we discussed even previously in another call around kind of expanding that green infrastructure, especially within a commercial district or a commercial corridor.
Yeah, I mean, as an engineer, first and foremost, the challenge is everything that exists under the street, and creating space for tree roots and plant roots is, and the type of soils that you need in order to allow plants to thrive, which is non-compacted soils, is really the biggest challenge in commercial districts. I've also seen a lot of challenges with business owners not wanting trees or plants in front of their business, feeling that it obscures their storefronts. So it's really a challenge across the board. And then I think maybe the biggest thing I ever hear about is maintenance of these types of infrastructure. So in a lot of neighborhoods and places, they kind of tend to become places where trash ends up as a result of both water flowing over the sidewalks and bringing the trash into them, and just as kind of repositories for it. So they're really big challenges that we face all over the city in both commercial and residential districts.
Thanks, April. I want to bring in a question here from Andrew Emmett from C2, kind of building on kind of the climate question and weather. One of the most obvious challenges to outdoor space and slow streets is winter weather. Most of the renderings show use during the temperate months, but could you speak a little bit more kind of the overwinter use? And maybe I'll just add on to that, something that we're thinking a lot about at the forum is extreme heat in the built environment. So how are you all kind of imagining as well as the hot summer months, as well as the very, very cold winter months?
Well, it may not have been immediately noticeable in the Broome Street renderings that I showed on the screen for 30 seconds, but thinking about where sunlight hits the district and when, and how you design the space once you've assumed that you might not have as much space dedicated to through moving vehicles, such as on Broome Street, it leaves you with a lot of space, and you can allocate that symmetrically or you can allocate it asymmetrically. And so we were thinking asymmetrically to allow for more of the public space to be given over and more of the trees, for example, to be where there's more sun. So it protects more of the heat, or creates more of the benefit of mitigating the heat island. It also provides the seating and the shade on the sunny parts of the street. And so I think there's some thinking there to respond to that issue. I think in terms of winter, there's a lot of issues we deal with during winter in terms of snow storage, thinking about all the ponding and pooling of slushy ice water with our streets. The thinking here is that with a shared street, you don't have that same issue, that you don't have all the ponding at the corners. that you're managing stormwater differently through channelized drainage along the linear edge of the street and through storage of snow, which becomes easier when you have more space to put snow into piles in a strategic way before it can be removed if we have a big storm. That's very challenging to do right now with the way the street's currently designed. I will also say that we did a lot of our analysis of the district over the course of the winter and early spring. So we were out there in the cold weather and we were seeing how the district performs. And of course, we were just coming out of the worst of or actually kind of in the worst of the winter pandemic. And so numbers and activities were certainly depressed from what we've seen the summer and into the fall, where there's way more activity happening, but we still saw a lot of activity. We still saw a lot of people on the streets enjoying places to sit where there are places to sit and walking around and socializing and using the district in all sorts of interesting ways. And so winter is a challenge operationally. It's a challenge from a pedestrian safety and accessibility, but it's also something to be worked with, to be celebrated, and to actually think about winter programming that brings more of these activities that people might enjoy into the streets. And if we're talking about economic development, bringing people in during winter months when the visitors might be a little more depressed offers that that extra shopper, that person who's going to sit down and have that coffee in the coffee shop. So there's lots of ways to think about how programming, design, and seasons all kind of work together.
Thank you, Mike. And of course, welcome anyone else to kind of jump in with any thoughts. So I'd love to talk a little bit about, because I'm starting to notice in the chat kind of the conversation around noise and potentially some co-benefits of trees and green space. With trees, we can see benefits of shade, green infrastructure for heavy rain, but also noise. And that was a really interesting component in the framework and the plan itself. I'm wondering if you all want to kind of speak to that around this noise study analysis of the neighborhood and how you kind of thinking about the role of noise and urban sound on community health. And kind of also interested from Jimmy's perspective, or even April's, how we can think about that kind of across the citywide as well.
Yeah, I'll start, and then I'll let Mike bring his planning perspective. We get complaints about noise all the time. I think it's from the honking to just having vehicles operate in the neighborhood to having deliveries made at night. A quiet night is an important phrase that we've come to use here at the office, and that's an important part of this. But I think noise in this neighborhood is ever present. Even at night when it's quiet, you still have a subway or a bus kind of coming through the neighborhood. So I think it informs a lot of our thinking and the importance of minimizing noise by reducing traffic. I think that's a huge, as we've just seen in some very initial work that we've done, just removing cars from a street has a tremendous benefit of reducing noise. But Mike, you want to talk a little bit about your approach and looking at noise?
Yeah, sure. So what we did was we sound mapped the neighborhood by walking the street several times and using a decibel reader through an app that allows us to kind of measure the cadence of sound over linear walks through the district. And there are certainly moments of peak, and there's the loudest corner in the neighborhood is definitely is Prince and Broadway. Broome and Broadway is probably second to that. And so we saw too much of the noise levels rising above what's considered safe. And I think that's primarily a concern for me, who's thinking about residents and thinking about the neighborhood and the quality of life. I'm concerned about that exposure to noise day in and day out. Or if you work in the district, as Mark does, you're literally exposed to that for many hours a day, and it's not healthy. And there's more and more research that shows the impact of noise. And I think Mark's right. We're not going to totally eliminate noise, but what are the ways to reduce it? And it's not just reducing driving, it's reducing the antisocial behavior that comes with being stuck and being frustrated and wanting to get someplace that you can't go. And that's where a lot of the noise comes from, is that frustration and the honking, right? Not just the baseline rumble of motor vehicles, it's the expression of frustration. And so the idea here is that we can reduce that level of angst and stress on the streets if we better plan for and acknowledge that traffic is one of the issues there. Not the only issue, but it's one of the issues that's driving some of the noise issues and complaints. And I think Mark's point is right. How do we? This is maybe the biggest challenge that I think we have as a team is how do you account for that overnight noise for people who are up late and rowdy and loud when folks are just, 15 feet upstairs into the second floor loft trying to sleep? Like I get that. That's a real concern. That's a little bit harder to control. You live in a city. It's not, there's permeability, there are streets, there are sidewalks, people come in, people come out. But anything that we can do, I think, in thinking through implementation to account for those concerns and where amenities go, what kinds of amenities go where, which buildings are more office oriented, which buildings are more residentially oriented, helps us to get to a really fine grain of how to respond to and help mitigate those quality of life issues.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, something I refer to a lot in my work is not just traffic congestion, but traffic chaos, which is a hard thing to measure, but is a massive source of noise in our city. And it doesn't have to be that way.
Absolutely. I want to ask just one more economic development question around the economic impacts, and maybe kind of open it up to you, Rebecca, and then maybe Jimmy as well with some of your expertise. Sometimes it's always a challenge to communicate economic impacts from investments in the public realm. Sometimes it's very challenging to communicate with small business owners or residents, especially not only Manhattan, but also the outer boroughs as well. I'd love to hear from the both of you how it's best to kind of communicate these ideas of investing in the public realm, both from within the district and SoHo, for businesses and residents, but also neighborhoods abroad, and how we're thinking about that as well for a more equitable economic recovery.
Yeah, well, there was a bunch of questions packed into that one sentence, Guillermo.
I know.
Sure. I mean, I think most simply put, when people feel comfortable and welcomed in a neighborhood where there's a place to sit down, there's a place to walk through, there's some shade, and again, where people feel safe and welcome and included. If you live in the neighborhood, if you're visiting the neighborhood, you're working in the neighborhood, then you're going to go to work there, you're going to spend money there, you're going to go shopping there. And that's directly tied to the economic health of a district. I saw in the chat, a call out not to say that this part of Broadway is a commercial corridor. I'm going to say that, there are many businesses on this part of Broadway. There is a lot of commerce and a lot of economic activity. There are also many, many people who live in this particular corridor. And we saw it really hurting. Like during the pandemic, we saw there are times when there was looting going on, many businesses boarded up. We've seen a lot of vacancies. And so when I think about how we talk about how investments in the public realm and these kinds of things can impact businesses positively, it's again, making sure that people feel welcome and that there's places where if they go and spend money, then they can spend time. It's a destination where they're going to stay. They're not just going to go to one store and leave. They're not just going to pass through. It's a place they're going to stay. And I know on the economic side, all the time, people will talk about, tax revenue, and they're going to talk about direct and indirect jobs and all of those things. And like in city government, we love to talk about that stuff. Consultants love to talk about that stuff. It's important because SoHo is an economic engine and part of a generator for the city. But I think as people, we want to be able to know where we can go and shop. We want to know where we're going to get lunch. And those things are really important. That's where I would say kind of writ large. Jamie, curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think Soho is unique because it has, so many of the kind of urban, sort of the positive urban characteristics that I think many neighborhoods like around the world would love to have. It's
absolutely
so walkable. It has, a kind of like this amazing character. So this is really just kind of enhancing or continuing to build on that, as opposed to, working in a neighborhood that's so auto-oriented or, the infrastructure is crumbling. I think probably for this district, and I see it a lot in the chat, is the tension between, having the public realm investments kind of reflect the history and the character of longtime residents, businesses, and store owners, right? And how do you balance that with, the kind of fear that, you're going to turn this into a mall stripped of all, character. And I think that's a real issue. I mean, it's a different kind of economic development conversation than I would have in another kind of place.
Absolutely. And I think the one thing, and again, to respond to something in the chat, I mean, there's a deep history in SoHo of the arts and the artist community that is active and remains vibrant today. And so I think as you think about that history, how do we reflect that in SoHo's future? Right, New York City is one where every time we're always talking about the rebirth of neighborhoods, and sometimes neighborhoods change completely. Sometimes we think about how to carry forth history, but like the art scene in SoHo is thriving, and we certainly heard that engagement as well. And thinking about how arts and culture remains central, and that we're planning for people who live in SoHo today as well as who will live in SoHo in the future. So really appreciate the conversation that's going on in the chat and know that it's been part of the thinking, and that's why the engagement is going to be ongoing. So just really appreciate the thoughts that are being put out there.
Perfect. Well, I know we're almost at 1:30, so I kind of wanted to pose one last question. Next week is a major historic election for New York, landmark election. We're going to elect a new mayor, majority new city council, a new borough presidents. I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts for future city leaders, of course, welcome across scales of government. How can we really think about, and what should we centralize in order to create more people-centered streets? The forum is really thinking very closely about that, especially with our Streets Ahead series. Maybe we can start off with you, April, Jimmy, and then we'll close it out with our final presenters.
I would challenge all of the newly electeds to think really big and not shy away from the big visions, despite how hard everything is going to be. But that's really what's required right now. And I think kind of central to the conversation as we talk about people, as we talk about freight, as we talk about waste, as we talk about vehicular movement and mobility is the environment and climate change. And that is really something that's deeply important to my work. And I think is something we should be really focused on moving forward.
Thanks, April.
I would just say it's, as I'm seeing it from this vantage point, it's not one size fits all. Be flexible and adaptable, and really let's think about safety both from the street design perspective, but also behavior and how we can influence behavior.
Thanks, Jimmy. And then the authors to the framework and the plan, how are you thinking about this project and also the future of the streets under the next administration? How can we get this vision kind of moving forward into a reality?
I guess I'll start. I think we've put a very bold but credible approach out there that really builds off of what we've seen work both in New York City, but also elsewhere around the world. SoHo is a very special neighborhood. It has a rich cultural history that has not had the investment in its public spaces that it needs. Our outdoor spaces in SoHo are our streets and sidewalks. They're not blessed with park. Central Park is not going to land in this neighborhood anytime soon. But it's a complex neighborhood that has a lot of different needs around people that live here, people that work here, the businesses of getting merchandise in and out. And I would echo Jamie's point. Like, don't be afraid to be bold. I think the pandemic has shown us what's possible, and there's so much more potential out there for us to achieve.
I would, I want to let Mike have the final word. So I'm going to say, I will always say, like, let's keep testing things. So don't let the totality, be the thing that stops us. It's a big vision. Like, let's pick a piece and try it, test it, measure, and have a feedback loop and continue engagement, so that we're always having that feedback loop to try things. And if I were to give the new administration feedback or ask for something as we're doing this, I'm always going to say, please listen to the small business community and hear what they need, particularly around giving clear guidance around the Open Streets and Open Restaurants program, because for many it's a lifeline. And across the board, we hear that they're asking for clear guidance around permitting and what they can and can't do.
Great, thank you all. I think I would just share, if I could, zoom out of SoHo where my brain has been fixed for the last 10 months. It's to think about, this has been an incredible privilege to think about these problems and work with the team here and listen and try to problem solve with residents and businesses. But at the end of the day, there are stewards here in the bid. There are stewards here who engage extremely actively in their neighborhood with resources. What I'm interested in the next administration is, how do we have this level of thinking and dialogue and be able to have every neighborhood go through a process like this? This should not just be for the 2% of land that is, organized and managed by our business improvement districts, as wonderful as they are for rethinking and pushing the conversation. People need an opportunity to really engage and have resources to plan and then, yes, implement change, even if incrementally to start, to work towards a better future for everyone in our communities. And that's really where the challenge is. I think we really need to rethink all of New York City, not just our slices of our business districts, as important as they are to the economy and to our quality of life. So that's my hope, is we can do more of this kind of thinking elsewhere across the city.
Terrific, thank you. I want to thank all of our presenters, Mark, Mike, and Rebecca, our respondents, Jimmy and April, and of course our attendees and fellows for such terrific questions and for tuning in today. And of course, my colleague Martha, who's behind the scenes supporting with tech. To learn more about the SoHo Broadway Public Realm Vision Plan, you can visit SoHo Broadway Initiative's website, and make sure to check out the final activation of Little Prince Plaza tomorrow on Prince Street between Broadway and Mercer Street. We have many great events coming up at the Urban Design Forum, including a presentation on new exciting visions and investments for Broadway just north with the Department of Transportation's Emily Wiedenhoff and Garment District Alliance's Jonathan Hawkins on November 9th. We'll plug in that link to attend an RSVP as well. We want to thank our fellows, of course, our board of directors and director circle again for their support. Stay tuned for more from our Streets Ahead initiative. If you have projects or plans you would like to discuss and share, please feel free to reach out to us at the forum. Have a happy and safe Halloween. Make sure to go vote if you have the power to do so. Early voting ends on October 31st, FYI. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.